So once again, we are discussing Chapter 16. Fiscal policy, which, as you know, is in the hands of the government, not the Fed. And this is policy in regard to government spending and taxes, right? And to quickly summarize, we have two kinds of fiscal policy. Well, you can break it up in a variety of ways. But for our purposes, the important distinction is between expansionary fiscal policy and contractionary fiscal policy. Now, what is expansionary fiscal policy? Designed to expand aggregate demand, hence equilibrium GDP. This, on the other hand, is designed to contract aggregate demand, hence equilibrium GDP. Right? Now, we have focused so far on this type of fiscal policy, expansionary. We've always couched our discussions in terms of recessions and what the government ought to do in a recession. Correct? However, the government might occasionally pursue contractionary fiscal policy. Can somebody tell me when contractionary fiscal policy would be called for? When there is inflation, as we know, correct? And what's the appropriate little diagram here, just to make sure you understand this? And once again, we have our diagram for the goods market of the economy, right? We have the AD curve, we have the AS curve, real GDP, the price level. And let's say we're in a situation where this AD curve has been moving to the right very rapidly. It's moving to the right like this. Now, if the AD curve is moving to the right like that, what's happening to the price level? Price level used to be this, and then next year it went up to that, and then again to that. Am I correct? So we have a rapid rise in the equilibrium price level. And what do you call that? What phenomena is that? That phenomena, of course, is inflation. Right? And inflation is a bad thing. We've discussed this in the past, correct? Inflation is an undesirable. And so in this situation, what the government will try to do is pursue contractionary policies. It will try to reduce its spending and raise its taxes, because the objective now is to somehow prevent the AD curve from shifting rightwards quite so rapidly. Right? So the intention of the government here would be to put the brakes on any rapid rightward shift in the AD curve. So this is when contractionary policies would be called for. By the way, this type of inflation has a name. This type of inflation is called demand pull inflation, because this is inflation caused by an increase in demand. Now remember, inflation could also be caused by a leftward shift of the AS curve. Let me show you what that would look like. If we have a situation in which there is a decrease in aggregate supply, meaning if the AS curve shifts like this, leftwards, well, that too, as you can see here, that too is going to lead to a rise in the equilibrium price level. The price level used to be that, then it rose to that, and then further rose to that. Correct? So here we have inflation as well, but this is inflation caused by a leftward shift of the AS curve. This type of inflation has a name as well. It's called cost push inflation. So we have demand pull inflation and cost push inflation. Right? I mean, that was a brief digression. So what were we discussing in class last time? We were discussing, if I recall correctly, we were discussing the national debt, right? And what was the substance of that material? Well, the substance is that when you have a government budget deficit, and you have a government budget deficit when government spending is bigger than its tax collection, this leads to government borrowing. And what government borrowing does is it causes the national debt to swell, to increase in size, because the government's adding to its debt. Correct? I then showed you the national debt clock on the internet, which was this enormous figure, 18 trillion or so. And if you divide that by the population, you arrive at some pretty large figure, $56,000 per person, something like that. And lots of people are worried about this large national debt, and perhaps it is worrisome. But as I mentioned to you in class yesterday, our debt to GDP ratio is only about 104% or so, which is not as bad as, say, the debt to GDP ratio of Japan, which is in excess of 225%. Correct? I also brought in the example of that school teacher who earns $40,000 a year, but has recently bought a home and has taken out a mortgage loan of $64,000. And so this person has a debt to GDP ratio of 160%. But we're not worried about her, are we? So why should we be so worried about our national debt? Because when you compare that to our nation's income, or GDP, it isn't that large, just a little bit bigger than our GDP. Right? So we were discussing these matters. Today I'm going to talk about something called supply-side economics. Supply-side economics. Now, this is a term that became quite popular in the 80s when Ronald Reagan was president. He popularized this idea of supply-side economics. He was a great believer in supply-side economics. So what is supply-side economics about? Let me explain this to you in terms of our familiar diagram. Again, I'm going to draw the diagram for the goods market. This is called the goods market, okay? Aggregate demand, aggregate supply. Real GDP, price level. So what is this called again? This is called the goods market. Okay? Now let's say that, so equilibrium GDP is going to be this. And let's say this here is full employment GDP, and so we have this recessionary gap that must be narrowed. Right? And if fiscal policy were used to do this, what kind of fiscal policy would the government pursue? Expansionary or contractionary? Expansionary, correct? An expansionary fiscal policy would involve government spending going up and taxes going down, am I correct? And as we've studied, this does what to the AD curve? This shifts the AD curve to the right. That's what we've been discussing so far, right? But now I'm going to tell you that according to these supply-side economists, the AS curve that you see here may also shift rightwards. This may happen as well. And this is what I am going now to talk about. A rightward shift in the AS curve might be brought about by expansionary fiscal policy. It's not just the AD curve that would shift rightwards, according to the supply-side economists. So what is the argument here? And before I proceed to explain this, I'd like to remind you of the factors causing a change in aggregate supply. You'd have to go back a few chapters to read about this, but let me give you the main point, okay? Let me quickly draw here for you an AS curve. Now this aggregate supply curve has what is called an anchor point. And let me explain to you what this anchor point is. If you take where this YF, full employment real GDP, is on the x-axis, if you go there and then you draw a line vertically upward like this to the AS curve, the point where you meet the AS curve, this point here, is called the anchor point of the AS curve. You may think of the AS curve as being anchored to that point. Okay? Now, if there were an increase in potential real GDP, in other words, if the economy's potential real GDP went up from YF to YF prime, and we will discuss this shortly. I've spoken about this before, but I'll remind you why this might happen. You see, the economy's potential GDP is not something that's constant. You see, the productive potential of the economy keeps growing, right? So what if YF increases from YF to YF prime? We will now have a new anchor, right? And how do you determine that new anchor? This is how you determine the new anchor. You go up from YF like this, and then you go to the old anchor point, and you move sideways like this. And so this shall be the new anchor point. Correct? Now, with that new anchor point, what happens? Well, since we have a new anchor point, we have a new AS curve as well. And that new AS curve shall be anchored to the new anchor point. And so that AS curve shall now look like this. This is a new AS curve anchored to the new anchor point. Correct? So what am I saying here then? What's being said here is roughly this. An increase in YF, potential real GDP, causes a rightward shift of the AS curve. That's what's being said here, right? An increase in potential real GDP causes a rightward shift of the AS curve. Okay? Now, next, what would cause YF to increase? Here's the next question. what would cause YF to increase? And here again, I'm going to go back to some old diagrams from a previous chapter. Okay? So this is material that we've done before, but I'm just going to put it together with this new stuff that we're doing now. And here, the relevant diagrams are these. This is a two-part diagram. Now, if you want a chapter reference, just hang on, I'll give you the chapter reference. So you will find all of this in chapter 8. Okay, so what are these two diagrams? The lower diagram is the diagram for the labor market. So here we have the quantity of labor being measured along the horizontal axis. And on the vertical axis, we have the real wage. Right? And in this diagram, we have a demand curve for labor and a supply curve of labor. So this is the demand curve of labor by firms. Of course, firms demand labor. And this is a supply curve of labor by workers. Right? We have equilibrium in this market, of course, where the two curves intersect. So we would have equilibrium in this market where these two curves intersect. Now let's consider this point here. Let me call that E. So the level of employment, the number of workers employed, or the number of man-hours employed at equilibrium, I'm going to call that E. Right? So what is E? E is defined as the full employment level of employment. So you have full employment when the labor market is in equilibrium. This is what we discussed in chapter 8. That's the definition of full employment. Everyone who wants a job has a job. Full employment. Okay? Now in the diagram above, we do the following. We have again the quantity of labor being measured along the horizontal axis, labor. On the vertical axis, however, we measure real GDP. So we have now a relationship between labor and real GDP. This is a input-output relationship. Labor is the input, the output is real GDP. So we now have to draw here in this diagram a production function. And that production function looks like this. Right? So what does that curved line show us? That there is the relationship between labor use and the output of real GDP. And it's curved like that. It's concave to the origin. Why? Because we eventually end up with diminishing returns to labor. Labor becomes less and less productive as we add more and more labor to a fixed quantity of machinery. See, it's a combination of labor and capital that produces real GDP. And the argument here is that at least in the short run, capital is fixed. So all you're doing is you're adding more labor to a fixed quantity of capital. So eventually, the increases in output that you would experience would taper off. And that's why the curve is like that. Okay, now what we need to do here is we need to project this level of employment E upwards to the diagram on top, like this. And then sideways like that. So this here, that level of employment is E again. And what's the level of GDP that corresponds to employment E, or full employment? That is YF. Right? this diagram make sense to you? So what is YF, potential GDP, or full employment real GDP? It's the level of GDP that would be produced when there is full employment in the economy. Right? Now let's look at factors that would cause that YF that you see up there in the upper diagram. What would cause that to increase? Let's look at that now. What would cause that to increase? Remember, we are trying to explain what? We are trying to explain the rightward shift of the AS curve here, which happens because the anchor point has shifted rightwards. And why has the anchor point shifted rightwards? Because potential real GDP has increased from YF to YF prime. So we are now trying to understand the factors that would cause potential GDP to go up. Right? And potential GDP is explained here in this set of diagrams. Okay? So the first factor that I will look at is an increase in labor productivity. An increase in labor productivity. In other words, if each worker were to become more productive than before, what would happen? Well, firstly, what would cause labor to become more productive? What are the causes of an increase in labor productivity? Well, there could be a variety of reasons. You could have, for instance, the improvements in technology. In other words, better machines. If workers get to work with better machines, they will become more productive. That could be one reason. Another reason could be an increase in the nation's stock of capital, which basically means more machines, not better machines, but more machines. If each worker gets to work with more machines, again, the worker becomes more productive. That makes sense, doesn't it? A third factor may be better or improved labor skills. And this may come from more education or training. So these are the various factors that will increase the productivity of labor. Now, what would that do to this set of diagrams here? An increase in labor productivity. Well, the first thing that happens is this production function in the top diagram changes, and it changes like this. Do you see that? Every level of employment will now translate to more output because workers have become more productive. Is that making sense? Right? So we have a shift upward of that production function. Now, what about the diagram in the bottom? Well, there, because labor has become more productive, firms will find it attractive to hire more workers at any real wage. And so in the lower diagram, we would see a shift rightward of the... sorry. That thing is still alive. In the lower diagram, we would see a shift rightward of the demand curve for labor. So this would happen because of an improvement in the productivity of labor. So let's put these two together now. So what is our full employment level of employment now with the improvement in labor productivity? Well, the new equilibrium takes place here, and so that is the new E, I'm going to call it E prime. That's the new level of full employment. Does that make sense? We will now project this upward to the diagram above. And this gives us a new level of potential real GDP, YF prime. These diagrams making sense to you? If they are not, I suggest you go back to chapter 8 or listen to the recordings that I made, the integrity recordings from this chapter. Okay. So what am I trying to say here? Let me summarize this. The main point being made here is that an increase in labor productivity can cause a rise in potential GDP. An increase in labor productivity could cause a rise in potential GDP. That's what we're trying to demonstrate here. Okay? Okay, let's get back to our supply side story. So we are now trying to explain what? We're trying to explain that when the government raises its spending, for instance, when G goes up, not only does AD shift rightwards, AS may do the same. That's what we're trying to explain, correct? Now, how would the AS curve shift rightwards? And that all comes down to the effect of G on YF. And that's what I'm going to talk about. An increase in G could cause an increase in YF. How? Now let's say that the increase in G is on the building of infrastructure. Let's say that the government increases its spending on infrastructure. Now, what is infrastructure? Has anyone heard that term before? When you speak of the nation's infrastructure, what are we talking about? Now, remember in the 1930s when FDR was increasing his spending as part of that New Deal, what was he spending government money on? Roads, parks, dams. All of that, in fact, is infrastructure. That's what we mean by infrastructure. So the nation's infrastructure consists of things like roads, communications, which would be in modern times high-speed internet cables, for instance, things of that nature. Ports, so that foreign ships can come and dock easily here. See, the building of new ports would increase foreign trade. You follow me? So the electricity grid. These are all part of the nation's infrastructure. And the government has a big hand in this. Of course, a lot of this is privately owned and privately financed. That's true. But the government has a big hand also in these projects. It subsidizes companies. It gives them tax breaks and so on. Am I correct? So they can go and build better infrastructure. In the event the infrastructure structure is in the private domain, right? So what we're saying here is this. If the government increased its spending on, let's say, building better roads, bridges, ports, things of that nature, what would that do to labor productivity, do you think? It would create more jobs, but that's something else. I'm now talking about how much a single worker can produce. That's what I'm after. That's what labor productivity is. You follow me? The same worker now working with better infrastructure, would this same worker be able to produce more output? Is the question. Now let me give an example. Let's say that in the old days, roads in this country were very poor. They were often dirt roads. There was poor connectivity. We're talking pre-1930s. And let's say we had a farmer growing produce. Let's say he was He was an onion farmer or something. And he had a couple of truckloads of onions to ship to market. He would load them on, in those days, a truck or a horse-drawn wagon or something. And then he'd have to go on these dirt roads for a long time, and by the time he reached market, some of his onions may have spoiled, rotted. Do you follow me? So what's happened to his productivity as a farmer? It's been negatively impacted by the fact that there weren't good roads. Now, if you have a good, spanking new highway, this guy can get his produce to market quickly without any of it spoiling. Now, doesn't that raise his productivity? That's what I'm talking about here. Right? So any improvement in infrastructure generally tends to increase labor productivity. So that's our story here then. If the government increases spending on infrastructure, this would cause an improvement in labor productivity. And what does an increase in labor productivity do to YF? Raises YF, doesn't it? As we've discussed, right? And what does a rise in YF do? It shifts the AS curve rightwards as well. Yes? And that is one supply side story. We have an increase in G, and that ends up causing an increase in not just AD, but AS as well. So this is one part of our supply side story. An increase in government spending on infrastructure would tend to increase AS. But that was not President Reagan's focus. When President Reagan was in love with this supply side economics, his focus was not so much an increase in government spending on infrastructure. Reagan was a big fan of tax cuts. And let me tell you how that would work. So according to President Reagan and his advisors, a reduction in taxes would cause something like this to happen as well. And let's discuss that now. Okay? How would a cut in taxes increase potential GDP and therefore shift the AS curve rightwards? And when we speak of taxes now, I'm going to talk about tax rates. If the government cuts tax rates, what does that do to individual incentives to work? That's what's key here. And what do you think would happen? Let's say that you are earning a gross wage of $10 an hour. That's your hourly gross wage. And let's say that the tax rate on this income is 30%. If the tax rate is 30%, what is your hourly take-home wage going to be? $7. Correct? Now, if the government cuts this tax rate from 30% to 20%, what would happen to your hourly take-home? It would become, so you're taking home more money for every hour you work. Now, would this have any effect on your supply of labor, is the question. If you make more money for every hour you work, would that give you an incentive to perhaps set your alarm clock a little earlier, so you wake up earlier, go to work earlier, work longer hours so you can make more money? Would this would this be something that's perhaps likely to happen to most of us? Would it? That makes sense, doesn't it? So a rise in your take-home wage acts as an incentive for you to work longer hours. So in terms of our diagram for the labor market, if I were to draw this diagram for the labor market, which was the lower of the two diagrams in that previous slide, okay, so I'm going to quickly draw that. So this is the demand curve of labor, supply curve of labor. This is the, this is the real wage This is the quantity of labor, right? And what happens here when the tax rate falls? So I'm going to call this the gross real wage. That's what you're measuring along the horizontal axis. So let's say that we have a certain gross wage of, let's say this. Let's say this is your $10 gross wage. And at that wage, workers like you used to supply this quantity of labor. Let's call it QL1. Right? Now, this is a gross wage. And what was the underlying net wage? The wage you took home? Right? Now, because the government's cut tax rates from 30% to 20%, what happens to that underlying net wage? It becomes, right? However, the gross wage is still $10. So what happens now? At that same gross wage of $10, with the lower tax rate, you have an incentive to work longer hours, QL2. Is that correct? Now, this point here doesn't lie out there in space, does it? It lies on a whole new supply curve. So we have basically, we end up with a new supply curve of labor. Am I making sense here? So this is the demand curve for labor. This is the old supply curve of labor. And this is the new supply curve of labor. So what's the point being made here? The point being made here is that a cut in tax rates causes the supply of labor to increase. Right? Now, question. Does this affect YF? Does this affect YF? And if it affected YF, of course, it would shift the AS curve. That's what we're after here. So let's go to this diagram again. So what's going to happen here now? I'm going to modify this diagram as follows. We are now talking about a cut in taxes, not an increase in labor productivity. So I'm going to do the following. I'm going to rub this out. We don't have this shift like this anymore, because there is no increase in labor productivity in our story here. We have a cut in tax rates. However, in the diagram below, what happens? Well, I'm going to rub this out as well, because we don't have this increase in the demand for labor. But what do we have now? What kind of a shift do we have because of a cut in tax rate? What happens because of a cut in tax rate? The supply curve of labor shifts to the right. Am I correct? So let's do that now. So we have a rightward shift of the supply curve of labor like this. And I've conveniently drawn it like that so that I don't have to redraw that green line, you see. Right? So we now have a new equilibrium where the new supply curve of labor, which I'm going to call SL prime, intersects the demand for labor curve. So we have a new equilibrium where this is our new equilibrium. That translates to a higher level of full employment, right? You project that up to the other curve on top, and this will lead us to, as you see here, now this is slightly poorly drawn because this curve should have been a little more, it should have been like this. This curve should have been like that, you see. Steep, it became a little too steep, but you get my point here. We have a shift upward of YF from YF to YF prime. Do you see that? So what's the point being made here then? Where they cut in tax rates, roughly, people have an incentive to work longer hours. If they work longer hours, of course, they would produce more real GDP. Am I correct? In fact, potential GDP of the country should rise if people work longer hours. Right? An increase in YF from YF to YF prime, what does that do to the AS curve? It shifts the AS curve rightwards, as you can see here. Right? So this really is what supply-side economics is about. Okay, to summarize here, in our old story, when the government engaged in expansionary fiscal policy, which is an increase in spending and a cut in taxes, only the AD curve shifted rightwards, from black to green. That was our old story. But now, once you bring in supply-side economics, the same policies of increasing spending and cutting taxes shall result in the AS curve shifting rightwards as well, from the black AS to the orange one. Right? Let's look at the effect of these shifts on equilibrium real GDP. So what was our old equilibrium? The old equilibrium was that. What's going to be the new equilibrium? The new equilibrium shall be this. Right? So we have a substantial increase in equilibrium real GDP, more substantial than would have occurred with a rightward shift of the AD alone. Correct? The increase in Y star is bigger than if the AD had shifted alone and there was no shift in AS. A rightward shift in AS speeds up that increase in equilibrium GDP. There's a bigger increase in equilibrium GDP. What's happened to the recessionary gap? Is the new recessionary gap this little bit here between this orange Y double star and the YF? No, because remember, a rightward shift in AS happened because YF itself increased. So we have a new YF as well, which is further to the right. Correct? So we can't be sure about the gap itself. You see, the gap may have even widened. But the important thing is that the level of equilibrium real GDP has increased faster than would have happened with a shift in the AD alone. Okay? And that brings us to the end of chapter 16. Okay? Stop here today.